Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I am your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Ben Ryan, who is a journalist who was focusing quite extensively on HIV medications and the politics surrounding that. And then over the last few years, he's turned his attention to pediatric gender medicine and is perhaps one of the most prolific writers on that particular beat at this point in time. In this conversation, we talk about pediatric gender medicine in the context of gay rights and the activist infrastructure that was set up to accomplish gay marriage. And we also talk about the state of the evidence and why journalists and news organizations lack the courage to report faithfully and clearly on this particular topic. Again, Ben is very prolific and is always on the cutting edge of whatever's happening in the gender world. You can find his work linked below. I highly recommend you check him out. Without further ado, here is Ben Ryan. Hey, nice to meet you.
You too.
I've been aware of your work for a while now.
Yeah.
You're very industrious.
Yeah, I guess I am. I my parents never stopped being productive. My mother, the only time she ever watched television was Masterpiece Theater for like 1 hour at 8 o'clock on Sunday evenings, during which she would brush the dog. So like there was no slacking off.
No
Once
downtime.
I got fired from a restaurant job when I was between years in college, and I would have like about 2.5 weeks of idle time. And my mother, in hysterics, said, "What are you gonna do with yourself?" This was summer vacation between, Ivy League years, mind you. My mother was so. The point is that I'm very neurotic, and if I'm not being industrious, I go bananas.
Hmm. Hmm. So what's the lay of the land? Where can we go? Where do you want to go?
Um, I'm not sure. I mean, I guess I'm more interested in sort of what your ideas were. I mean, there's so much we could talk about, but
Yeah.
I mean, one thing, there's this sort of meta level of what it's like to work in media and what I would characterize as a circumspect point of view from covering kid gender medicine, and how toxic and inhospitable that is, both for writers, but also for editors. And so there's a chilling effect across the media industry that selects what people see and what they don't see. And
Hmm.
I think that's a big part of what people can't understand about what the sausage is made, is that topics, once they make it to you, they're only the things that have made it through the filters. And as the media industry contracts and people are much more risk averse, editors, will say flat out, like, it's not worth it to me. I don't want to lose my job. Nobody wants the Glad truck driving around their building.
Yeah.
So that really affects what is able to be covered. And I know that happens at both ends of the spectrum as well. There's people who are reticent about having the other side of activists and, seeming sort of too affirmative, if you will. And like, it's just untouchable for a lot of editors, I think.
Yeah. And that creates a feedback loop of, pressure points where activists or where certain ideologies can just kind of claim a topic and then
Yeah.
police the topic.
Yeah. I think it's sort of like, would you want to like sort of have me just tell about myself and then we can kind of lead into that?
Yeah, let's
Yeah.
let's start there. So
Hmm.
I see your work mostly in what you call gender or kid gender medicine or child gender
Hmm.
medicine.
Yeah.
How did you get there?
Yeah. And long story, coming out of Columbia, where I was an English major, which is something that I took off my bio because people will rail on me for not having scientific training, which is true. But had a lot of learning on the job. But I had done all this volunteer work in the HIV arena in my teens and through college. So I started writing about that epidemic for magazines right out of college. There's, because of all the pharmaceutical money, there's a lot of money that can support different publications about that topic, which is a bit uncomfortable when you realize sometimes you're saying to yourself, am I just writing text to accompany ads for pharma? What is really going on here? I've done that throughout my career covering HIV, and starting in 2012, Pause magazine asked me to be their science writer. So you're basically the guy who processes all the studies that come out. Some of it's just digesting, you're sort of recapitulating other people's reporting, or you're doing original reporting.
Hmm.
So that was great kind of boot camp, full immersion into science reporting, just having to do it constantly day after day. And I published something close to 1 million words in the 8 years that I spent with Pause Magazine. And it also gives you great insight. Once you know enough about a topic, you can start to see where scientists are sometimes being disingenuous and they're
Mm.
allowing political goals and concepts and ways of describing things to supersede their scientific honesty, if you could say, or accuracy. And in particular, I was, I do think I'm the person who has written the most about PrEP, the HIV prevention pill in the world. So
Hmm.
after writing, hundreds of articles on this topic, you start to see that people are making false claims about the list price of the drug being the primary reason for a lack of substantial uptake of the prevention modality amongst gay men, especially gay men of color. And it was never in any of the literature. There was all of these complex reasons why gay men do or do not take PrEP or, do or do not adhere to the daily drug regimen. But I was never really seeing any literature that showed a direct through line to a primary cause being the expensive nature of the drug, because there are all these different ways of getting it covered, be that insurance or other payment assistance programs, et cetera. So, and then you can get on a meta level and say, like, well, yes, but if we weren't spending all that money, we could spend it better somewhere else. But that's very theoretical. And that's essentially what some of the activists were saying. But you would also see people, in these medical conferences I would go to, just standing up there and telling what I knew to be falsehoods, essentially. And this really culminated, I think it was 2019, I believe it was May of 2019. AOC and others held a congressional hearing about the high list price of Truvada. And there was this whole panel of experts, including Rochelle Walensky, who at the time was at Harvard and ultimately became the director of the CDC, and other activists and doctors and that sort of thing, and people from nonprofits, and as well as the head of Gilead, whose name eludes me. They all got up there, and everyone but this one guy was the wonky guy who knew everything about drug pricing. He was just like parachuted in. He had really didn't have anything to do with the subject in particular, but he knew all the ins and outs of this subject. All said things that were incorrect, and with the utmost sincerity. So it's really hard to tell, like, do they know they're telling falsehoods or what? AOC went viral with a clip where she said people are dying because they can't get this drug, which is objectively false, because it's a preventative therapy for a condition that takes 10 years to die from, so long as you're not treated that whole time. So not enough time had even passed for that to ever happen.
Mm.
So I, would write things or push back on social media against this narrative about the notion of the drug price being the primary factor inhibiting uptake of PrEP, and was just inundated with this onslaught of anger and pushback, both in public and then private. And it was really alarming. And I was told by my editor, if you continue to aggravate these activists, we will fire you. This was made utterly clear to me. And they put a moratorium on my covering PrEP. And this was devastating to me, because I had really claimed this subject as like my primary area of expertise. I was extremely proud of that. And I was muzzled. And that was in July of 2018, and that happened. So I spent little over 2 years at this publication, muzzled and infuriated. And just having lost such faith in my editor's ability to stand up to bullies and to take a stand
Hmm.
about what is news and what is our role. Are we just an extension of activists? And a lot of activists really believe that, and they're very incredulous when they say, but you're not repeating the party line. You're a gay man, and you're not going in line with what the activists say. What's wrong? This confounds a lot of people. And I'll say to them, and I remember having this tense argument with a very prominent HIV activist, and I was saying to him, you're expecting to me that I'm one of you per se, and I'm not. I'm not here to push an outcome. I'm here to tell the truth. Your job is to push an outcome. And this person even told me, though, as activists, the grand old days of ACT UP, like, truth was secondary to the mission. And they said this flat
Hmm.
out. I'm like, well, good for you, but like, that's exactly the opposite of my own standards as a reporter.
Wow.
So all
Yeah.
that is to say, like, that was my general experience with pushback and the tension that occurs, the disparity between what's expected of you and what you're going to perform as a journalist, between you
Yeah.
and the public, in particular, very loud activists, and how aggressive they can be in trying to silence you, get you fired, that sort of thing. So I got interested in pediatric gender medicine in part because it was 2016. I wrote two pieces for New York Magazine, one of which ultimately was killed, and I published it at the Marshall Project. And Jesse Singal was my editor. He's the
Hmm.
most intense editor I ever had. And
Hmm.
he's also 6 years younger than me. So at the time, I was 38 and he was like 32. And I guess I was, yeah, 38. And I'm thinking to myself, am I a terrible writer or what is it? Whatever it was, I was familiar with this guy. And then it was right 2 years later that he published his big article in The Atlantic about pediatric gender medicine that caused such a kerfuffle. And the reaction to that, as well as what it had to say and what people had to say in response, set the tone for the pediatric gender discussion as we know it today.
Hmm.
And he was publicly flogged. He was essentially canceled. And I observed all this somewhat from afar. At the time, I wasn't really that much on Twitter, but I was certainly very aware that this person had been tied to a post and whipped in the public square, so to speak. And, wanting to know whatever the truth is, I'm like, is what they say true? Does he write with malice? Does he say things that are incorrect? Is he, omitting certain key details that would undermine a point? And then all these other personal assaults on him, that he was creepy, somehow some sort of a pervert, obsessively defending himself against attacks and going after people who attack him. So I never found any evidence to support this notion that Jesse was a terrible person. And to this day, have not. And I think he's incredibly intelligent and he's, circumspect, and that's what we need. And importantly now, he's also independent. So people can't cancel him because he is a Substacker. So that's very valuable if you want to get information out of the public because the filter is essentially gone. That level of an institution trying to protect a reputation, as I experienced writing about HIV, this is a very small publication. And if they lost the faith of the activist core, essentially their idea is they were screwed and they'd all lose their
Yeah.
jobs or something.
Yeah.
Who knows if that's true? But that was their primary goal, was keeping the peace.
Yeah.
So it was the end of 2022. Monkeypox came, two things happened. Monkeypox, summer of 2022 came, and I also had cancer. So those things happened at the exact same time. So
Hmm.
like this is me getting sick from cancer and chemo, and then this is the monkeypox epidemic curve. It was very strange. They both
Hmm.
peaked exactly the first week of August. And so here I was getting bald and swollen and sick and covering this crazy outbreak, and then it all just ended. And so I'm looking around the end of 2022, and that was around the time earlier that year, Emily Bazelon's piece had come out in the New York Times Magazine with regards to gender medicine. And then it was that fall that the New York Times came out, I believe it was in the fall, with a couple of different pieces. One was about puberty blockers by Megan Toohey and another reporter. She was the Me Too reporter, won the Pulitzer for that. And
Hmm.
the activists were furious. And so and that was also the time that Reuters came out with their series on pediatric gender medicine. Those writers never really put themselves forward as public faces, so they weren't really flogged. They wrote the series and they just sort of left. They sort of never heard from again on the subject that I'm aware of. But all of this was very interesting and informative to me. But what was especially informative was the infuriated response from the activist core. And I was increasingly on Twitter. And I saw such a discrepancy between what they were saying about what these articles were supposedly doing and saying, and the disingenuousness supposedly of these reporters and what was actually in them. I mean, I read them over and over,
Hmm.
looking, for malice, never seeing it. And at the core is this question of, here we have this cohort of young people. It's growing substantially. It's changed in its demographics, its dynamics. Young people are much more likely to start identifying as transgender and or have gender dysphoria in adolescence. They're much more likely to be natal girls, much more likely to have autism and other psychiatric comorbidities. So all this was very interesting to me. So I remember it was right Christmas time, 2022. I tweeted there was an article about detransitioning in Reuters and how few researchers actually study it. And in particular, there was one from York University in Canada, Ross McKinnon, who's a trans man, who's one of the few people who actually studies this. And so I went out and I don't usually say opinions on Twitter. I try to be really careful about that. But I think I saw it as okay just to say, like, it would be a good idea to study this more, that this should be encouraged. We all should like to have more knowledge on this subject. And Alejandra Caraballo, who is a trans woman activist, who is a lawyer, and she's a clinical instructor at the cyber law clinic at Harvard Law School. I don't know really what
Hmm.
that means. How are you a clinical instructor? I mean, she's not a professor there, whatever that is. In any case, she went bananas, started attacking me on Twitter and just making up all these things about me that I had said. And this was
Simply
scary.
because you asked a question or forwarded
I
that
because
more
because
research
I
should be
said
done?
I think it's a good idea to study detransitioning. We shouldn't discourage intellectual inquiry.
Hmm.
And you know, this was her shot across the bow, her warning to me to stay out. And so
Hmm.
most people, I think, confronted with somebody with a very large Twitter following, I think she has something like 150,000 followers,
Yeah.
would have silenced themselves permanently after that one occasion. And that's what this behavior is for. I am not that type of person. I grew up in a household with, older brothers who were bullies and, developed a strong sense of self, in the face of that to say like, no, this is who I am and you're not going to quiet me. And so that dynamic just went from there. And then I started reading more and more about it. And it was very hard at first studying the subject because you'll read one paper and it'll say one thing like, this is troubling. These kids are getting into these meds and puberty blockers, there's process hormones, and then there's all these side effects and nobody knows what they're doing. And, it's low quality of evidence. And then you read another paper that says exactly the opposite with the same conviction and that from somebody who is equally as credentialed. And that was really baffling to me. And I think what's virtually impossible for almost all people to try to understand this subject is the amount of time that it takes to study it, to really understand it, and to know, oh, you're looking at a paper like, oh yeah, I know that footnote. Oh, yeah, it's Florence Ashley,
Okay.
and then you know exactly who Florence Ashley is and what she represents or what they represent, and what how their work is perceived, across the spectrum. So acquiring that level of knowledge is almost impossible for the average person. Nobody has time. And there was this period of time where I was writing a story that ultimately got killed for publication about pediatricians working with kids who have gender dysphoria or otherwise identify as transgender. And this to me seemed like a very obvious article that no one had written. These people are on the front line. They're the first point of contact, oftentimes, in the medical world for a child who may ultimately seek a medical transition. So, what's their experience like? And so I started interviewing. I talked to a couple dozen doctors before they ultimately killed the story because they were too nervous to publish it. And what I found, and granted, is what in science you would call a snowball effect, snowball sampling, where you're asking one person to recommend other people, and that's how you get your cohort. So
Hmm.
all of the skeptics kind of came from one initial source. And then there are just the other pediatricians. And there was a very obvious delineation between the two groups. The skeptics had all done the reading, so to speak. And there was always a reason they said of how they were able to do it. My my husband takes care of the kids in the evenings. I'm single, and during the pandemic, I was between jobs and had a lot of extra time. All of these reasons why they could devote the amount of time required to understand the subject, whereas the other pediatricians all said, well, I trust the American Academy of Pediatrics. I trust the WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. And if I have a child in that position, I will refer them out to a gender clinic. And I trust that the AAP standards, are valid, et cetera. And that's what you're supposed to do. These organizations are supposed to analyze the science for you. Nobody has the time to study everything, and so that you're given essentially a package of like these are the standards and the protocols, and trust us because we know what we're doing. But ultimately, the AAP's policy statement, written in 2018 by a single person named Jason Rafferty, who at the time was a resident at Brown, has many factual holes in it. And the AP reaffirmed it last August and said they were going to run a systematic literature review of the evidence, but there's no evidence that they're actually doing that a year later because they haven't
Hmm.
registered their protocol with this site where you're supposed to do that
Yeah.
called Prospero. So that's how I got interested in all. And a lot of it was, I guess, there are always just sort of psychodynamic reasons why it interests me as a gay man and such. I don't necessarily want to put out too much of my own personal experience because people will just use it against me. But it is clearly a very important subject, one that is of great importance to many families and children across the country. And it is woefully undercovered by journalists because of the climate. And ultimately, Alejandro Caraballo took an email that I had written looking for sources for that piece that got killed in the spring of 2023. And I knew this was going to happen, but she published it on Twitter and it had my phone number in the bottom of it. And this was a Friday morning, 2 days after they killed the story. And they said, this publication is going out to, another anti-trans piece. This writer is evil. It shouldn't say evil, but like that was the gist of it. And she never talked to him. And the tweet got 2 million views. I got all these harassing phone calls. Immediately got a phone call from the publication, worried about my safety. We scrubbed my home address from the internet. So it's an out-of-body experience being dragged with that level of ferocity, intensity, and having
Yeah.
people writing you and telling you're a Nazi and all these sorts of things.
Yeah.
But it only for a lot of people they wouldn't be able to handle it. I'm thinking of the movie of Veronica Guerin, which was this movie in the early 2000s, Kate Blanchett, where she's playing this true story about this journalist in Ireland who had gone up against all the drug barons in Ireland. And I'm not saying at all that I'm not comparing drug barons to transgender activists, mind you, make that very clear. But there's this scene, where they've come from her, they've beaten her up, and she tells her husband, like, "Don't tell them I was ever scared," And there's that element of like, this is very scary being attacked in this way, and being this is the downside of being a public figure, like you asked for it, but at the same time, the level of resolve, that she has in the film, I relate to that
Mm.
general mindset of I always say that there's this element of people saying about pediatric gender medicine, don't look at the man behind the curtain. Don't look there. Don't look. There's nothing there. And obviously there's nothing there. But they
Hmm.
wouldn't argue this with such ferocity, and
Yeah.
they would have a more sound intellectual argument of why you were wrong about something. And therefore, it's a goldmine of stories because no one else is doing it.
Yeah.
So there's that element, and just it's very important that people cover the subject from a level of circumspection. And there are a few people that are able to do that. But like, we just need so much more of it for the public to be able to understand this important issue. That's a very long-winded question.
Why children? Why not just, why don't they just defend adult trans medicine? Why do they
Well, I mean,
so ferociously
yeah,
defend children?
yeah. It started in the Netherlands in the mid to late 90s. There's a clinic there, and they developed a hypothesis essentially saying, what if we channeled young, highly gender dysphoric children into the opposite sex puberty? And especially for natal males, this is greatly beneficial because if you've gone through a male puberty,
Yeah.
such as you and I have, you have a stronger jawline and wider shoulders, and you have big hands, and your nose is different, and you have a deep voice, and all of these things. You're taller. So the
The
general
holy grail
idea,
of passing.
yes. So, and you'll see that in the initial papers where it is front and center. The idea is we want to help these people pass, and that a secondary benefit of that is better mental health because you don't have the stress of worrying if you pass, and your gender dysphoria would be less about all these elements of your body and your appearance that are more like the opposite sex and the sex with which you do not identify. So over time, it's not clear to me why this shift occurred, but over time, the mental health aspect shifted to be the primary selling point that was discussed. And passing, I think perhaps was probably seen as too cosmetic. Maybe it wasn't something that would appeal as much to American insurance companies, you might argue. Therefore, the defense of it had to be mentally health related. And in particular, at the pyramid of that came the idea of the treatment being life-saving, that young transgender people, gender dysphoric people are highly suicidal. And this is true. There's certainly very good evidence to support the notion that young people with gender dysphoria or otherwise identify as transgender have very high level of suicidality. But the idea
Not
is that
totally out of step with other mental health conditions.
Um, true. I mean, you could go into the minutia of it. There's a study out of
Yeah.
Finland that suggests that the real association was not necessarily with gender dysphoria. The proxy for that they used was attending a gender clinic, but rather with all the other psychiatric comorbidities. So if you wiped one out, you would still have the psych comorbidities affecting supposedly or having the strong association with suicidality. And a lot of people can go back and forth of like, well, which direction is that occurring? Is the
Okay.
gender dysphoria causing the psych problems, or the other direction? Or minority stress theory is the hatred towards intolerance of transgender people causing all these mental health problems, et cetera. But the problem with the idea of this being life-saving care, prescribing puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones to children, is there's only the most inferential evidence to support that claim, or at least there was until the spring when somebody finally studied it. The idea that, well, we've seen surveys and, having taken these meds is associated with lower suicidality. Some of these surgeries are taken years later. So the quality of them is very low. So that finally Finland, and they have full national data. There's very little in-out migration. So they have data on people's health for their entire lives. So that makes this a very valuable country in which to do this kind of population level research. And this is a very controversial finding, but they found that there was no independent statistically significant association between having gone through what they call gender reassignment, but receiving gender cross-sex hormones and a difference in the suicide death rate. Now, the suicide death rate was low. These outcomes were still very rare. So there's often a big gulf between suicidality itself and actual suicide death. Of course, they're associated, but a lot of the discourse presumes they're a lot more closely wedded, and one predicts the other much more clearly. So you can get into a lot of minutia about this, but there's a lot of debate about that paper, whether the p-value cutoff should have been 0.01 or 0.05. And if it were 0.05, therefore it would have been statistically significant. But whether you put the cutoff in one place or another, the point is these outcomes were so rare, it's so difficult to find to determine whether there was a difference. As Marcy Bowers, the president of WPATH, told me when I interviewed her about this study in February, suicide death is not a good marker to determine the efficacy of pediatric gender transition treatment. Other markers such as depression, suicidality, your gender dysphoria, resolving that sort of things are probably better. And I was the only American journalist, sadly, to cover this study, which is the only study ever to seek to answer the central point that people make to argue for the benefit of pediatric gender transition, which is that it reduces the risk of death. And the study itself found that there wasn't evidence for that. And so were it not for me, Americans probably never would have heard of this pivotal study. And I'm not sort of singing my own praises there, but to say, like, isn't it sad that there's such a vacuum in the media? Whereas if there weren't, and editors weren't terrified to cover this for fear of backlash, like, everybody would have covered this study. And then there would have been a much more healthy discussion about it in public.
Yeah. So, truth aside, who are the people who are involved in this pitched battle? Is it a pitched battle? Am I editorializing too much to say that? The people who are trying to preserve and forward child pediatric gender medicine, and the people who are trying to either stop it or slow it down or understand it. What's the lay of the land here?
I mean, there are those certainly who are trying to stop it and, more aggressive activism. And then there are those who are what I would characterize as intellectualizing it and concerned about the evidence quality. So this is a very controversial group, but the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, or SEGM, they're sort of central in that space where they're all a bunch of wonks and they sit there and they analyze papers all day long. I went to their conference in Manhattan last fall. I mean, it was just a crash course in evidence-based medicine for geeks. And on the margins, there were some people who were there who were a little rowdy and political, but there was very little political content in any of the presentations. So you'll hear from people like Gordon Guyatt, who's considered the godfather of evidence-based medicine. He's at McMaster University in Canada. James Cantor, who's a psychologist also in Canada, who's a sexologist, who's very controversial, in part because he's one of the paid experts who goes into all of these state legislatures and is paid handsomely to argue against pediatric gender medicine being legal, or for the bans, rather. And that's, you have to, whenever you point that out, these people get paid, like $400 an hour. The other side gets paid the same amount. So Jack Turbin out of the University of California, San Francisco, gets paid the same amount to go to argue against them. So, you see an article in HuffPost that was, I think it came out a year and a half ago, pointing out like what Stephen Levine from Case Western and I just said his name and I can't remember
James Cantor.
James Cantor, get paid. Yeah, but good old Jack Turbin gets paid the same. So that wipes out your argument. It neutralizes it. Like, why are any of these people doing this? Is it because they just see a gold mine and they're doing it in bad faith, just genuinely? Or is it because they genuinely believe in the cause and they get paid for it handsomely? So in any case, there's a spectrum of activism and intellectual space, and then there's a lot of zealotry on either end of this.
Yeah.
Alejandro Caraballo, I would certainly characterize as a zealot on one hand. There's and you'll see a lot. I don't necessarily want to name names right now, but there are certainly academics who behave with zealotry, and they're sort of paper over a lot of inconvenient truths in their writing and their
Hmm.
publishing in the academic space and such and such. You'll see that in both sides, but I the Southern Poverty Law Center has characterized SEGM as a hate group. They wrote this enormous report that came out last fall. It took me, I think, about 5 hours to read. And I always say, but I was on the treadmill. So I burned, several thousand, a few cakes, in the process. But it was littered with typos quite infamously, which weeks later they still hadn't fixed. But
Hmm.
long story short, it characterized SEGM as a hate group. And,
What does that
you know,
mean? What is a hate group?
good question. Not sure, but they certainly stirred up a good specter about them that, well, they're connected. There's all this guilt by association. There are all of these charts in the report which you can look at, of line. These are the bad guys and these are the other guys, and these are all the lines between them. And it's very confusing. And ultimately, you're like, okay, somebody wrote a check. Does that mean they're calling the shots? Is anybody independent? I don't know. But
Hmm.
mostly, I think it's called like a gish gallop in terms of like its style of
Yeah.
argument. If you just kind of
Yeah.
inundate somebody with enough, they'll just say, I don't understand this, but clearly those guys are bad. And that's essentially what that report did. I do not myself consider it to be an intellectually sound report. It was,
Yeah.
I would argue that it was effectively reverse engineered to make Saigon into a hate group. But ultimately, a hate group, I think, is a group that disingenuously and or in bad faith argues, against the rights per se of a certain protected class.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
So trans rights.
yeah.
Yeah. What do you think about you mentioned there's a man behind the curtain. The curtain,
Hmm.
from my perspective, are these certain magical phrases or words that
Mm.
kind of thought terminating cliches, like a trans
Hmm.
kid. Like,
Right. Yeah.
what do you think about these? Like that concept.
Yeah.
What do you think, or what have you been able to reliably, confidently say about the
Yeah.
reality of the trans kid? Not as a political
Yeah.
reality, but we can talk about the political reality of it because that's where a lot of its power is.
Hmm.
But it's reality.
Yeah. Well, yeah, first of all, a trans kid is very significant in a medical concept if that triggers a prescription for drugs, for puberty
Okay.
blockers and cross-sex hormones. Technically, you're being diagnosed with gender dysphoria, and that's what would trigger insurance to cover it and such. So gender dysphoria, which is the long-standing discomfort and it affecting your ability to function with your natal sex and body as compared with your gender identity. If there's a substantial discrepancy between you perceive yourself as female or you would want to be female and you are biologically male. So those two things, being a transgender kid and gender dysphoria, overlap but are distinct concepts. The problem is this idea of if a child comes in and at whatever age says they're trans, will they always feel that way? And that's the big question. And, the literature suggests that the older somebody is, the more likely that their identification with being transgender will persist and then they will not ultimately regret receiving these drugs. So I myself have taken sort of an editorial position where I am comfortable with saying children who identify as transgender or trans identified child. It's interesting because the first longer phrase never triggers an angry response.
Hmm.
But the compound adjective trans identified child does. That is considered a slur. And I've gotten in public arguments. So I say to people, if the central concern of this debate is whether or not these kids, regardless of whether they identify as trans now, will continue to identify that way and therefore should be put on drugs now for the rest of their lives that they won't ultimately regret and they will impact their fertility and their sexual function. That question is a much more or up in the air for children, especially prepubescent children. Mind you, those aren't the ones getting drugs, but they're maybe on their way yet because going into puberty, that's what would trigger the possible need for prescription. So I consider it to be acceptable and in my own copy policy of saying trans-identified child or child identifies as transgender,
Hmm.
because there is certainly evidence, and there's more coming out soon, that these things tend to waffle, especially when you're an adolescent, and that's what adolescence is about. And you hear from such as the head of the Finnish pediatric gender clinic, or one of the two of them, Dr. Kaltiala, who wrote the suicide paper, saying like by definition, adolescence is a time of identity confusion and search for meaning. So it is always normal. And the classic sort of corny parallel, or goth teens in the 90s, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'm certain
Yeah.
that many young trans people would find that insulting, but that's where a lot of people's minds will go. If you're a Gen Xer, like I remember all of these goth kids, went to that, or they got into grunge or punk, and now they're a banker, and they wear boat shoes. And
Yeah.
so maybe that's a fair comparison, maybe it isn't, but that's kind of where people's minds will go about, can really we take on faith what a child says about their needs at that age? And there are policies. The American Academy of Pediatrics policy is really to trust the kid, let them lead the way.
Hmm.
But in an environment in which children cannot consent to medical treatment before the age of 18 legally and cognitively is the idea, adults, parents and guardians and doctors need to consent on the child's behalf. The child can only assent is a legal term.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're talking about putting a child onto an on-ramp starts with social transition, and theoretically that can more lock in a transgender identity. That's very controversial, but let's just say it might. Puberty blockers, there's supposedly a time to think, but the evidence suggests that almost everybody who starts them goes on to cross-sex hormones, and that they really just see it as a way station.
Hmm.
Okay, you're going to make me wait this period of time to get what I really want, which is the cross-sex hormones. That process can keep a child from ever becoming fertile and possibly cause lifelong sexual dysfunction.
Yeah.
And it's especially true in natal males who identify as female, that your testicles, if you start puberty blockers at 10 or 2, there's 5 stages of puberty. 10 or 2 is the first onset of puberty. The child will maintain a micropenis. Their testicles won't really descend or grow, and they'll never be able to produce sperm, as long as you coast them into a female puberty. So the question is it ethical, absent a fatal condition such as cancer that would require chemotherapy or, say, surgery on the reproductive organs of the child that would make them infertile? Is it ever ethical, or how can it made to be ethical for adults to decide on behalf of a child who may be between the ages of 9 and 12 at the onset of puberty that this is the best course of action? And the argument that they would die without it, which is made constantly, is very weak at the least, in part because those suicide deaths, despite all you hear, are thankfully rare.
Hmm.
But what bothers me about that argument is, as somebody who's experienced much mental health problems in my own life, suicidality and such, being suicidal is a horrible way to live. And only focusing on whether they died or not really takes so much of the needed attention away from caring for people who are so unhappy they want to die. And
Hmm.
so that's something that really bothers me. Like, isn't it enough to argue that perhaps these treatments are beneficial because they keep people from wanting to be suicidal, as opposed to only worrying if they live or die?
Yeah.
So obviously, life or death is a stronger argument or metric, but there's enough suffering with suicidality, that I think that warrants more focus.
Hmm.
In part because there's more evidence to support that these drugs are associated with a difference in suicidality. At least the cross-sex hormones are associated with a difference in mental health from some moderate quality research.
Hmm. You brought up the reaction that you get with trans-identified
Hmm.
child,
Yeah.
and there's this meme or cliche about receiving flack when you're over the target. Like there's something
Mm.
weak there that's causing a reaction. What do you think of,
Hmm.
is the operative word identified, and why would it be
If
that
you say
people?
identified, it puts a stress on an impermanence. They just identify it that way. They aren't, and you see this in the English language compared to, say, French. I
Yeah.
am 46 years old. I am 6'1". Whereas in French, you would say, I have 46 years, or I have this, I don't know if it's I had this height, but
Oh, yeah.
to me that's a very important linguistic difference. And
Hmm.
these facets of linguistics do perceive how we perceive ourselves. And in English in particular, there's much more essentialism in the language we use to describe ourselves.
Mhm.
Um, I am a lawyer as opposed to like I do something.
Yeah.
So I think that really unnerves English language speakers when you say trans-identified because it gets away from gender essentialism is really the philosophical term. So
Yeah.
you'll hear Jack Turbin in his book and elsewhere in his writing, he'll say that they have a transcendent sense of their gender. So you're getting really philosophical and metaphysical there.
Yeah.
So if you apply the term identify in there, even though the term self-identify is all over, public health literature these days, and
Yeah.
which always bothers me because it's a redundant term. You don't need the self in there. I think the term is like transitive direct verb or something, but you identify. I don't identify as a man or self-identify as a man. I identify as a man. Anyway, my mother is an English teacher, so
Okay.
grammarian is like, why people? My mother once I had this English teacher who wasn't very smart, and we both thought that of him. And he said something to the effect of like, well, between Ben and I, and my mother like immediately just said Ben and me to him, like right to his face. And, um, my mother's long dead, so like no one can find her to
Mm.
say
Oh,
she's evil. But
bless her. Yeah.
so I think that's really what you're getting into the core of a philosophical argument about being transgender. The argument
Yeah.
like, do you have a transgender brain? Which the flip side of that is
Mm.
there's social contagion. All the other kids in your class, you're from Seattle and you go to one of those crunchy private schools.
Yeah.
I'm from Seattle and went to a crunchy private school. People don't use the word crunchy or granola much anymore, but
Yeah.
it might be
I know
some
what you mean.
version of
Yeah.
woke. But kids out there, crunchy just used to mean like really touchy feely. All the teachers were hippies. We sang folk songs all the time. They were totally inappropriate. Some of them were about like drinking. There was, and so that's really what you're getting to the core of this. Like, if there's a social contagion, therefore medicalizing these children is really sending them on a way station, sending them off course, where it would be akin to like permanently tattooing goth makeup on a child of the 1990s. So
Yeah.
that's how the arguments sort of go, and why that is very triggering, to use the common term of the current day, to
Are
many
you
people.
much invested in the philosophical aspect of this discourse?
Uh,
Do you mind venturing there? That's what I'm.
I mean, we
I have a
could. I mean, it's
question
not
if you have anything.
necessarily, I don't know if I'm like as much of an expert per se
Yeah.
in that, but it's certainly interesting.
Yeah, a lot of the what is now considered gender essentialism or
Hmm.
gender transcendentalism, it's descendant from social constructivist
Hmm.
kind of the idea that gender is socially constructed has
Like
somehow become
Judith Butler
the
queer
Judith
theory,
Butler stuff
postmodernism.
preceded.
Yeah,
I don't know if it caused, but it seems to be intimately linked to now.
theory. Yeah.
Now you are trans. You're a trans being
Hmm.
that requires, as a part of your being, a medical procedure, which is
Right.
external to you. There's a lot
Seems a little
of just
contradictory.
inconsistent. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Well,
how does it all add up? And is that why they're so defensive
yeah.
about it? Because if you start poking around, things start falling
The term
apart.
incoherent is used a lot these days. You hear that.
And you
Yeah,
would
the
agree that it
argument is
is incoherent. Yeah.
Well, one thing I could certainly say that is incoherent is this notion. There was this transgender cyclist who went on Trevor Noah. Her name is Ivy something or
Oh
other,
yeah, yeah.
and she
Veronica
said,
Ivy. Yeah.
I'm not a transgender woman. Like, I am a biological woman, and this was confounding to me. And he very quietly, and you can really see like all of the self-editing he's doing in that clip.
Trevor
Whereas,
Noah.
if we're, let's just say it was like a Republican congressman, like he would have nailed that person to the wall and said, like, this is how you're being inconsistent. But
Yeah.
all these caveats and apologies. Well, let me just ask you if I could. Um, but if there's this notion that sex and gender are somehow one and the same, if that is true, then why in the world would a transgender person need cross-sex hormones? It's because they are one biological sex, and that's also considered to be an untouchable slur, saying somebody has a biological sex. If that's if you're saying that's not true, then therefore it's incoherent that you would need cross-sex hormones to effect the other sex. And this idea of it being using terms like gender affirmation treatment or gender affirmation surgery is you're affirming the gender, but what you're most literally doing is you are changing sex
They're getting
attributes
the
of your
sex, yeah.
body to
Yeah.
seek to pass. And some of them may have a function. If you have a neovagina and you want to have intercourse with it, et cetera, or, phalloplasties that include the urethra if you want to pee standing up, very complex surgery with lots of complications. So
Hmm.
there is a lot of incoherence. It does bother me to see journalists using terms like gender affirming care and sex assigned at birth, because gender affirming care in particular just has a baked in political statement, which is that that person's gender is what they are, and essentially what they are, therefore we must give them these medical procedures which have various risks and so on. And
Hmm.
even if they change their mind later, that's just part of their gender journey. You'll hear that as kind of an explanation of why detransitioning isn't bad
So
or
they
something.
can change, and that's fine, but they're
But you're
immutable
affirming
right
it at
now.
that time,
Yeah.
you know, okay. But sex assigned at birth drives me bananas because something like 1 in 5,000 or 5,500 babies are born with some sort of differences of sexual development, otherwise known as an intersex condition, wherein their genitals, for various reasons,
Yeah.
may provide an
Appear.
inaccurate
Yeah.
appearance, an inaccurate determination of their actual biological sex. And we saw that in the Olympics with all of this discussion about the boxers. I'm not pretending to know what their exact conditions or sex are, but in 99.9% of cases, anyone without any training can look at the baby for 1 second and accurately determine their sex. The term sex assigned at birth was actually created because of DSDs, because they were effectively assigned an incorrect sometimes sex. Oops, it
Yeah.
turns out this person actually has testicles that are embedded in their body and they don't descend, but ultimately they produce testosterone and you go through a male puberty, etc. So that's what that term means. So it's been misapplied to include the transgender experience, whereas you have a biological sex, and that's the conflict. And that's why you would assert that you need cross-sex hormones. What's wrong with acknowledging that? But I think the reason why people
Hmm.
blur
To
sex and
preserve it.
gender has a legal goal embedded into it, whereas if you are that sex and sex and gender should be treated as one and the same in the law, therefore you have access to locker rooms, competitive sports, and other benefits or whatever they might be associated with your gender identity. And so we're
And
seeing that
insurance
play out.
money.
Yes, and that as well. But I don't know necessarily it matters which sex you are, but in terms of your right to compete in the Olympics or to go into that locker room or bathroom, um, these have very strong and important ramifications legally. So I think that that's what the term sex assigned at birth is for, is to sort of influence those laws. And you're
Hmm.
seeing the Supreme Court grapple with this right now, with the case over the Tennessee ban, the gender transition ban for children there. Is this under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment sex-based discrimination? Sex is a protected class
Hmm.
because these treatments are being denied to people because they're transgender. And the argument by the ACLU, they submitted their brief yesterday, is that is on its face discrimination, because the whole point of denying this treatment is because they're transgender, which they're trying to argue is a sex-based discrimination. They're trying to put into the law, in the interpretation of the 14th Amendment, that being transgender is ultimately you are a member of a protected class. Therefore, laws should be subject to a higher strict scrutiny, a higher level of scrutiny about whether they are discriminatory.
Yeah. Well, aren't there competing discriminations in that sense? And then how does the law, if you don't mind venturing here, how
Well,
does the law
so
decide which one's more important?
the minutia of this case will not boil down to whether these treatments have been proven by science. It's really a more arcane legal argument, which is so the law says people under 18 in Tennessee may not, for the purpose of treating gender dysphoria, changing their sex presentation, receive puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones. So, the ACLU and the Biden administration say hey, this is discrimination because look, these drugs are used amongst other children for precocious puberty, the puberty blockers. They're also used for adults for various things, such as, I think, polycystic ovary syndrome and various other things. They don't mention that they're also used to chemically castrate sex offenders, but no, put that one in there. But so the argument, as I understand it, that's been made by the Tennessee Attorney General and the Solicitor General is this is not sex discrimination because if you're comparing it to those other conditions, those are apples and oranges. Comparing apples to apples is the fact that these treatments are available, in particular the prostate hormones, to adults. The cutoff is an age-based discrimination per se. We're discriminating against
Hmm.
this group in a way that we think is appropriate. Um, and age is not a protected class under the 14th Amendment.
Hmm.
So those are the competing arguments essentially. It's probably a little bit more complicated than I'm able to
Interesting.
describe from my own. I mean, I did interview the Attorney General of Tennessee, but one thing to sort of as an aside, it's very difficult for me as positioning myself as what I would describe as a circumspect reporter, although I'm certainly described by others as like an anti-trans activist or
Yeah.
in, like close to with ties to the gender critical movement. It was someone described me that way this
Oh
week.
no, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
but there is almost a uniform blacklisting that occurs instantly once you're walk into that space. You're
Yep.
you're essentially through with a lot of sources. They will not talk to you.
Hmm.
And this has affected my HIV reporting, which I continue to do for various outlets.
Yeah.
There was one piece I worked on for months, and it was about a policy coming out of the CDC. And there was a group of HIV advocates and people working in that space, doctors, et cetera, nonprofits, who concern themselves with this particular issue. I mean, it's really getting into the weeds of HIV advocacy, but they have a whole listserv that does nothing but discuss this one issue. And that was how they were able to very easily coordinate. And I knew this because there were like moles who told me this from the organization.
Hmm.
And so they were very consistent. And part of what one of the moles told me is even if these advocates think you're fine, they've read your reporting, they think you're a fair reporter, they would love to talk to you to advocate for their position on this issue, they can't because they would get kicked out of the group. And so that happens on unless formalized ways all over HIV advocacy. There are people who work for major organizations who are very intelligent, who have advanced degrees, who I've known and interviewed for 20 years, who will no longer speak to me. And
Yeah.
what's amazing to me is not one of them has come to me and explicitly told me what their problem is. To say, we read you said these things, you did this, you talked to this person, you reported this, you made these claims, whatever it might be, and therefore what you're doing is wrong and I can't be associated with you. They all just ghost. And so a couple of them I've just written to ask, I would like to be clear. Have you stopped talking to me? I would love to know why. And they won't respond. And that is a shame because if they had a substantive argument, one would hope that they would be able to present it that might ultimately influence my behavior and my reporting,
Yeah.
but they don't, which leads me to just disrespect them, frankly. So that's a shame because then their voices aren't in my reporting. So,
Hmm.
but they don't want to be
Yeah.
associated with me.
Yeah.
I think that's the real clincher for them.
Yeah. One,
They
one
can't.
um one context of the gender issue, broadly speaking, is feminism.
Mhm.
But another context, especially in the activist side of this issue, is this following gay rights, the gay rights movement.
Mhm.
Could you inform me and
Yeah.
my audience about that context? Like, how does gay
Yeah.
rights inform the
Yeah.
strategies and the power, like the reach of
Yeah.
specifically child gender medicine?
Well, there's an idea that, well, LGBTQ, we're all in that same acronym. We all have the same parade. All these major organizations like the HRC and GLAAD, they're all LGBTQ organizations. Therefore, these are comparable experiences. So in theory, the idea is, oh, well, there was this horrible period, especially in the mid 20th century, when gays were tortured and they were put in mental institutions, for years against their will, and all of these horrible things were done to them to try to convert them to be straight, such as shock treatment and emetics and aversion therapy of all kind and being put in religious camps. And so all of this was terrible. And we learned as a society that these people are gay. They were gay from the start. Trying to change them is terrible. We must never treat anyone like this again. Here come young trans children. We have a chance to do it better this time. Therefore, there shall be, you must trust them. They know who they are. Trust the trans child. You heard Diane Aronsat from UCSF, she said in an article a few years ago, like, you want to know a child's gender? Ask them. And can't remember, Garofalo from Lurie Children's has a famous video that was making the rounds recently from a few years ago, where he sort of laughs when he says that parents come into them in their gender clinic thinking that they're going to explain to them, or maybe like reason with this kid about whether they're trans. And he's like, we just asked them. And so a lot of the motivation, explicitly is we can't make the same mistakes of the past. And you'll see that, in Democratic policies and the Democratic Party, in the ways that they influence regulations about Title IX and that kind of thing, or insurance in what's called Section 1557. It's a part of the Affordable Care Act, including gender identity in sex discrimination under that, opened the door in 2016 in the Obama administration for all the insurance coverage for these sorts of things. Yeah. Opened it much wider, than it was before. So I see it guiding a lot of the discourse, or gay men and trans people who are, say, my age, in their mid-40s or older, thinking to themselves, either A, I'm trans and I really wish I'd gone through the other puberty. I would love to help younger people, younger versions of myself, suffer less. And then, also gay people saying, I always knew I was gay from the time I was 3 years old. Therefore, it must be the same with trans children. So the question is it? And I am not at all arguing that anyone should attempt to force someone to change their gender identity. But there's a difference between conversion therapy, I would argue, others would disagree, forcing someone, compelling them that you may not, present as the other sex, and affirmation treatment, which is a sort of deference that all involved parents, schools, doctors are expected to observe with respect to this kid's gender, as opposed to somewhere more neutral where you're kind of putting it aside, and like exploratory therapies that they use that's become somewhat pejorative. But that is the nature of psychotherapy, is exploring these concepts, as opposed to just sort of accepting right out of the bat, you are transgender. And you'll see Diane Aronsat and Jack Turbin have a paper about what happens in a biopsychosocial assessment before a kid may get puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones. And they make very clear, this is not to determine whether the child is transgender. That is amazing to me, because that would seem to be a central responsibility on the part of everyone involved.
Why would they not try to assess that? No questions asked?
I would love to ask them that.
And who benefits from not questioning?
But all they say is, this is what happens in a biopsychosocial assessment. You should discuss risks and benefits and try to make sure they have support, and, what's it like at school, do your parents accept you, and all of these kind of things. So it's supporting them in their gender journey. But it would strike me as a fair argument that it is the responsibility of all of those adults in the room to determine if this child would be best suited, and not to essentially put the decision in their hands about whether to receive these very intense medications.
Is transgender, so far as you've been able to concretely observe, the same as sexuality, homosexuality or heterosexuality?
I think that gender identity is far more complex, multifaceted, dynamic, and elusive, and hard to define and put your finger on than sexual orientation. Especially for males, males have a physical barometer that tell them if they're attracted to somebody.
Yeah.
And so that makes it perhaps a lot simpler to determine if you're gay or not. Like, are you turned on by guys or not? I think with women, sexuality is more diffuse and complex and can shift a bit more. But especially with men, gay men, it's very consistent. Like, I always know it's different. Maybe it took me a long time to figure out, but yeah. And granted, especially these days, a lot more people who identify as bisexual, but just like tried and true gays, they are gay. Whereas being transgender is like, we all have different ways that we affect our gender in public. And some people men are naturally more effeminate. Is that because you're gay? Who knows? I have a history of ballet dancing and studying it as a student, and it's interesting to see straight men who came up in the
Sorry,
ballet world
you have a history
of a
of
history
ballet
of
dancing.
ballet. I took up ballet when I was 29 years old, and I did it very intensely for like 13 years.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
I'm
interesting to
sorry to
see,
derail you. So
yeah,
heterosexual men are
straight
in
men who
this. Yeah.
trained as ballet in ballet from young children, so they're around gay people all the time. They do things with their body that are considered to be effeminate, and yet there is a masculine way that is expected of you. That this sort of like Porter brought. You can't really see it. There's a way to do this that seems very feminine, but there's also a way to do it that seems very masculine. You
Okay.
know,
Yeah.
there's a gender roles are very important in classical ballet.
Yeah.
It couldn't be more important. But it's interesting to see people who spend a lot of time around gay guys presenting as more gay. It's sometimes it's hard to tell with a straight ballet dancer. So
Mm.
is gender presentation partly just a reflection of who we hang around? And it's like picking up an accent,
Yeah.
you sound gay, that sort of thing. So I just think that perceiving it as being totally akin to sexual orientation is really oversimplifying the matter and
Yeah.
shortchanging people in their ability to try to understand themselves in particular,
So
especially
we we
children.
we tackled, or at least overviewed, surveyed the narrative context for
Hmm.
trans rights in the wake of gay rights, but what about the power infrastructure? The
Oh yeah.
the absolute
Yeah.
chokehold that up until
Yes.
very recently trans rights advocates have had on the
Yeah.
most powerful medical and social
Yeah.
levers of power. Like what how did that
Well,
and if we can
yeah.
understand that, then maybe we could, counter it, or at least adjust the medical institutions,
Hmm.
the political institutions towards more reasonable, assuming that they are
Well, I
less
just want to
reasonable
make a
than
distinction,
us.
that I wouldn't consider myself a part of the we that you just expressed. That's not my
Yes,
role to
of
say
course.
that
Neither mine, but
GLAAD should fall or
that's
whatever.
probably,
But
yeah.
I certainly am an advocate and will publicly advocate all the time if GLAAD says something that is incorrect, which they do constantly. Most centrally,
Imagine
the
that.
science is settled, as they've
Yeah.
claimed about pediatric gender medicine. So gay marriage legalized 2015. That was a real turning point, and I like to say that I was in the room per se. I was there when it happened, when gay rights pivoted to trans rights. So it was at Stonewall. I'm here in New York. Everyone's very excited. Gay marriage legalized. Edie Windsor gets up, and Robbie Kaplan and all these politicians and various famous people sang or something. And then this trans woman gets up. I don't know her name. Trans activist says, "Okay, all you got what you wanted. Don't you dare leave us in the dust." And in a sense, that did happen in New York State when the Empire State Pride agenda, it was legalized again, New York State 2 years before 2015, and they closed up shop. They're like, well, we had one goal, we're done. And that
Hmm.
infuriated a lot of trans activists because they say we're still trying to pass these bills in New York State to protect our right against discrimination, et cetera. And
Hmm.
so, you know, all of a sudden, like the needle sort of went off the record, that moment of celebration after the overture fell. That word makes me crazy because it's so hard to pronounce and type. I don't know how to spell it. And all of a sudden there's this sort of chill in the air, like you better not forget these people. And that was around the same time that Orange is the New Black was on TV, Laverne Cox, soon after Caitlyn Jenner. And so there was this real turning point in the mid
Hmm.
2000s wherein HRC, Lambda Legal, ACLU, and GLAAD pivoted to focus more on trans issues. And there was a lot of reporting about how HRC at the time in particular was really populated by these kind of like white bros in DC, I think. And
Oh
there was a lot
yeah.
of flack about that. And so they, I think they really made a big effort to diversify their staff, be it racially or gender identity wise. And they have been very successful at raising money. This was also 2016 was when the bathroom bill thing started. So that was North Carolina. And it's very interesting to see the difference between in 2016, North Carolina tries to pass a bathroom bill to prevent people from using the bathroom that's associated with their gender identity as opposed to just their sex. And all of these corporations and the basketball associations say we're all going to pull out our conferences and we're going to deny you all this business if you pass this heinous and discriminatory bill, and it killed it. Whereas today, now, the last 3 years, we've seen all these bills that are primarily about gender transition treatment, but snuck in there are a lot of bathroom bills. And
Hmm.
you don't see anybody pulling out anymore. I think those democratic forces have essentially just been worn down. It's the tidal wave is so huge they can't possibly say, "Oh, well, we're going to pull out of Florida." Well, big deal. Like all these other states are doing it too. Like you're going to pull out of all the
Okay.
states.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the power structures started to focus. You see also Michael Biggs, who's a sociologist at Oxford, has done these little charts you can look up. Just Google like GLAD annual report, Michael Biggs trans, and it's a chart that shows the proportion of the numbers of uses of the words of respectively lesbian, gay, transgender, and bisexual. And in the earlier years of the 2010s, it's mostly gay, and then it just switches. So it's all trans. And
Hmm.
there's nothing wrong with that. Like, I'm not saying that at all, but like it is an objective illustration of the switch in focus.
Hmm.
And it clearly has been very successful in raising money. The Trevor Project is also in there as well. So all
Yeah.
these raise a lot of money. And as we've seen from the New York Times reporting, there has been a strong connection between the raising of money at GLAD and the use of first class tickets and luxury hotels by the head of GLAD, Sarah Kate Ellis.
Yeah.
So that came up recently. So you see, ultimately, these organizations are fond of their bully pulpit with respects to politics, but also with journalists. So there are, strict guidelines of how you're expected to report about these issues.
Hmm.
They're on their sort of reporters' guidelines, but then there's how they treated the New York Times after all those articles came out that I mentioned by Emily Bazelon and others that so upset the trans advocacy community. Uh, GLAD put together a silent letter, and then there was a letter protesting the New York Times. I don't actually know who spearheaded it, but it was signed by all these people who, at least ostensibly or largely, had been contributors to the New York Times at some point. I had heard of almost any of them, frankly, but in any
Hmm.
case, there were thousands of people had signed these two letters between them, and they all were released at the same time in February of 2023. And that on that day, GLAD drove this truck around the New York Times building, or it might have been parked. I had somebody try
Yeah.
to fact check this once. Was it parked or did it drive? I'm like, I don't know. I'm only looking at photographs. I'm looking at video. But it was one of those trucks that you can put like light up words on the side. And one of the major claims, ultimately the point is they think the New York Times is harming young transgender children with their bad reporting, ostensibly, is this idea the science is settled. How dare you question the science about puberty blockers when it's settled? We know these things to be true. These treatments are good. They are life-saving, period. And that is false. And almost nothing, you could argue that no science would ever be
Well,
settled.
yeah,
We had
but
gravity
this
wrong,
is
even
this
long after
particular topic is
you know,
not just not settled; it's actively suppressed. You can see that.
Yes. Yes. And to give you some examples of how it's suppressed in the academy. So Sally
Yeah.
Baxendale is, I believe, a neuropsychiatrist at a university in the United Kingdom. And she published an article in Unheard a few months ago about her struggle to publish a paper in which she reviewed the evidence about what kind of neuropsychiatric impacts puberty blockers have on young people. And ultimately, she did publish the paper, and her conclusion was largely, we don't know, and there are a lot of concerns. And so, concerns
Hmm.
about, possibly impacting IQ. And some of these are just in animal studies, like literally in sheep. So
Yeah.
who's to know? But the point is, these are powerful drugs. And this notion that they've been used for decades for versus puberty, okay, that's one thing, but what really bothers me about people saying that these two things are akin to one another, precocious puberty is delaying early puberty to its optimal set point, whereas using it for gender dysphoria is delaying puberty past its optimal set point, possibly to somebody is 16. And maybe there are no consequences to that. Or maybe all of the things that happen in our brain at that time, myelinization or what have you, should
Hmm.
need to happen in sequence. And if they're thrown
Yeah.
out of sequence, that could be very harmful in theory. But what we do know, and I had a brother who went through puberty somewhat later, and I fortunately had my growth spurt eighth grade. Perfect timing, showed up to high school, relatively tall, little young man. my older brother is he was 16. He was a junior. He finally grew and he was quite short. So I have witnessed how stressful this is to
Yeah.
be a small prepubescent person in high school when all of your peers are taller and girls don't like you, whatever. So my brother was very
Hmm.
popular, but
Good
so
for him.
anyway, Dr. Baxendale published this article about how she was trying to get this published in various academic journals, and the reviewers were pushing back on her and saying things like, "Why are you even asking this question?"
Oh,
And that tells you a lot. Another
yeah.
person told me, well, I can't go into the great specifics, but
Yeah.
an academic told me that they were trying to do some research about something that I can't really specify too concretely, but that they were told that by this other group that they had to collaborate with, you can work with us but you have to publish favorable data, and if you don't, you have to couch it in a certain way. You know, so this is what's going on behind the curtain, per
Yeah.
se. And this is troubling to have that kind of suppression of free inquiry about drugs that are very powerful, even if they have been used for decades for a certain purpose, and are FDA approved for that purpose. There are plenty of FDA drugs that have been approved that later were shown to be harmful, most notably Vioxx, or you could get into all the minutia about the FDA approving these Alzheimer drugs and whether they actually do anything, et cetera.
Hmm.
But as I said in my first moment of tweeting about this in public almost 2 years ago, we should support free inquiry. I feel as a journalist, it is
Yeah.
right and okay for me to take that stand.
Yeah.
And it is troubling to me to find out that things like this go on. And, the cancellation that goes on for, I think Carol Hooven was her name at Harvard. She
Hmm.
said sex is binary, ultimately destroyed her career at Harvard. She had to leave.
Yeah.
Colin Wright, very similar. He was trying to find it on the job market, having gotten a PhD in evolutionary biology, I believe, a few years ago. He said sex is binary. He was summarily canceled. All of these activists went and warned all the potential employers not to hire him, and he was not. And now he's a Substacker and is successful doing that, so good for
Yeah.
him. But similarly with Jesse Singal. So you see what happens to people who make an example of themselves and take a stand that, 10 years ago would have been, "Oh, why are you saying sex is binary?"
Yeah.
And now the Overton window, I guess you could say, has been so flipped on its head that now no one is allowed to say that. I myself once said one of the worst Twitter draggings I had was saying that sex was binary about Ivy, Miss Ivy, the cyclist. I said
Hmm.
that sex was binary. Oh my, it was uncanny. And I'm thinking, I'm not stating an opinion here. Like, this is an objective truth, which is all around us, and it was the most fundamental facets of being a human. And one of the
Yeah.
first things that we learn about other people is that there are boys and there are girls. You
Hmm.
see toddlers, preschool age kids, niece and nephew, obsessed with this. It's a girl, it's a boy. Like
Yeah.
to deny that is to deny reality. And that's when you can go to the ideas of how postmodernism and queer theory
Yeah.
has impacted our ability to express obvious concepts. This
Hmm.
notion that nothing is real and, the meaninglessness of signifiers and so on. If you've ever
Do
read,
you,
The Crying of Lot 49.
do you have any predictions about this topic, where it's headed?
Yeah. Well, it's behind the scenes, like all the people who are kind of in the critical arena, you could say, are constantly saying these days, is this the dam breaking?
Yeah. Right.
Is this it? Did it
Yeah.
break? One thing, or oh, is the Glad investigation the moment, the turning point?
Yeah.
Uh, I don't know. Here's what I think will happen, almost without a doubt. Um, I predict that the Supreme Court will probably rule that the Tennessee ban on pediatric gender transition treatment does not violate the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. I'm predicting this could be wrong because Gorsuch could throw you a curveball the way he did with the Bostock decision in 2020, which decided that it was under the Civil Rights, I think it's Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. It was discriminatory for a transgender woman who had been presenting as male, then transitioned to have been fired from a job working in a funeral home. And there was nothing sex specific about that job. There are some jobs where maybe you would have to be. It would make sense for that women couldn't do it. If let's say you could make the argument that women aren't strong enough for a certain combat role in the military or something. But in this case, that was discrimination. So in theory, what legal folks have told me is that they think that the Supreme Court took on only that question of equal protection and not a complaint from the ACLU about due process, that they only wanted to clean up Bostock to say, we only meant this specific thing about
Yeah.
the Civil Rights Acts. We did not mean that transgender people are a protected class akin to sex. That the transgender identity is akin to sex and being protected class. If that would have a tremendous spillover effect on all law to do with transgender people. So, and on the reverse, that was what the ACL is very afraid of, is that it will be determined that they're not a protected class, and so it would be much harder to argue the case in that transgender people are being discriminated against in
Yeah.
myriad
That they belong
circumstances.
in
So
women's prisons and all the
yeah,
other things that
all of
they're
those things,
working on.
and
Yeah.
you see, you can see the way that Obergefell, ultimately, and this is what Alito or Scalia was so upset about, was that this was going to impact abortion, or not abortion, but adoption and all of these things, because, and I remember Andrew Sullivan arguing this, around the year 2000. He came out front saying we should fight tooth and nail for gay marriage, because if we validate that central aspect of being gay, having a partnership, all of the other rights will spill from that. And I remember him arguing that in a speech he gave that I went to when I was right out of college, and it being very convincing. I agree with him, and he was ultimately right, but ultimately there was also backlash to that.
Mhm.
So I think it'll probably happen that next June, unfortunately, in the middle of Pride Month, the Supreme Court will probably say that the ban in Tennessee itself, it does not violate the 14th Amendment. Then what happens is all the lower courts kind of have to sort that out. They have to follow that. So there'll be a processing that will occur. And ultimately, there will probably be 26, maybe 27, 28 top states that will have some sort of ban on treatment and surgeries, puberty blockers,
Mhm.
cross-sex hormones, and surgeries. There's only two states, I think it's Arizona and New Hampshire, that only ban the surgeries. So that then we'll have, ultimately a patchwork situation the way we do with abortion. A lot of those states will probably be one and the same, red states,
Mhm.
essentially.
Mhm.
Or not essentially, they are, controlled by Republicans. So that leaves the remaining states. That includes where a lot of the major research is done, UCSF, in Chicago, in Boston, in New York. But
A lot
then
of the
you have,
research
so
or
it's not
research.
it's not research. I mean, we're talking about like major NIH grants,
Okay.
longitudinal studies of young
Are they
transgender
trustworthy
people.
in your opinion?
It's not my place to answer that question directly, but I can certainly say that, two of the big studies that have come out of the papers that have come out of that, called Tordoff et al., Tordoff et al., and Chen et al., Diane Chen. Those two papers greatly misrepresent their findings in their discussion. And
Okay.
the Chen paper in particular makes mention of the fact that of the, I think it was 317 young people who received cross-sex hormones over a 2-year period, two of them had died by suicide. It's an extremely high rate. Granted, it would have a wide confidence interval if you're going to get into statistics. So not necessarily, because it could be, a very tragic fluke that these two happen to happen and weren't in this case, in this study, and they weren't necessarily associated with the study itself. But it's worth asking. So you're saying these treatments are life-saving, and yet one of the major studies that's been millions of dollars been pumped into it, and supposedly it's a high, decent quality study. Two people died while on treatment. Um, they don't really they have to mention it, but they don't
Mhm.
discuss it in their discussion, and they really inflate the results. The press releases they go about these studies greatly inflate their findings, and they're
Hmm.
really very minor shifts in psychiatric metrics. And in particular, in the Tordoff one, this was a strange study design where it started off where some of these kids are on treatment, either puberty blockers or cross hormones, and others weren't. And then gradually, some of these went into the treatment group. And so the comparison group kind of shrunk over time. And then it was only 12 months. So there was, it was like month 0, 3, 6, and 12. They had measurements.
Hmm.
And their conclusion was that there was a 70%, 72% lower suicidality rate in the treatment group compared with the untreated group. And of course, this was couched in causal terms by many people, even though it's only association. But the problem is there was dramatic loss to follow up in the untreated group. A lot of them dropped out. And there are only 5 people in remaining who gave data at the 12-month last point. And it's also a very short period of time, mind you.
Yeah.
Um, and they were very unwell. So a high concentration of very unwell. Is that because they didn't get treatment? Or is that high concentration because the well people left? You know what? I
Yeah.
don't need this anymore.
Yeah.
I feel fine.
Yeah.
We don't know, but we do know that the authors of the study were totally incurious about this and essentially papered it over. And you get Jesse Singal, who thankfully is incredibly intelligent and writes these substacks about it to digest this for us and to realize
Yeah.
this is effectively deceptive. The results of these papers, as they are presented, they are suggesting that this treatment caused a strong benefit, but it's not actually there because there was no change in the treatment group. Granted, this is ultimately a different group of people each time with more and more people joining it. The treatment group's psychiatric metrics did not change. The only thing that changed was the composition of the untreated group
Okay.
and them ultimately being unwell. So all this is to say that there's all this litigation right now. They're approaching
Yeah.
24 different lawsuits, fraud, medical malpractice, et cetera, against various healthcare, mental health care practitioners, surgeons, by detransitioners, people who transitioned sex with cross-sex hormones and or surgery, and ultimately reverted to their birth sex. These people regretted it, and now they're suing. And so, some of the arguments will be, well, there was one that's against Jason Rafferty, the guy who wrote the AAP's major policy statement about the
Which is still
gender-free care
enshrined,
method,
right?
very much enshrined, reaffirmed
Okay.
last year.
Oh, okay.
Jason Rafferty and the AAP are being sued by a detransitioner who says that there was a major meeting. This person was a biological girl, a teenager, and there was a meeting between the physicians and the parents. The parents disagreed. Father supported, I believe it was the father supported the medical transition. The mother didn't. The mother was conferencing in over the phone. And somebody said some version of the mantra, would you rather have a live son or a dead daughter, which is reportedly has been said very widely to parents who are reluctant. And the argument in the case is that this is coercive and it subverts the informed consent process
Hmm.
because it's not factually based. And I, I would agree with that because of my own reporting that there isn't research to back the claim that if you don't give this drug to the kid, they're very likely to kill themselves. And they have a higher rate rather than not treating them. And so if only one of these cases that are out there now, they're going to take a couple of years to go their way through the courts.
Yeah.
One has
Yeah.
been approved to go to trial in North Carolina thus far. If one of them makes a good payday, you're going to see a feeding frenzy. There's like one law firm, these white shoe guys, they borrow a bunch of money. There's 4 of them. They started this firm in Dallas, or it's somewhere in Texas, Dallas or Houston. And between them, they have 17 children. So like these guys got to make a living. So they're taking the risk on behalf of so many other law firms. And then there are other firms involved in this too, but like especially these guys, that's like the only thing that they do. Is if they or somebody else in this whole industry, if you cottage legal industry make a big payday, then the floodgates will open for other people looking for
Yeah.
money, whether in good faith or not.
Yeah.
That will impact insurance premiums. It's already impacting insurance premiums,
Hmm.
and that may drive clinics out of business. It may make them much more risk averse. Some people may push back in the other direction, saying like, oh, if you want to deny my right to do this as a doctor, therefore I shall go into this because I want to be out there fighting the good fight. You might see that, but it might become prohibitively expensive to even practice this type of medicine. So in the way that OB/GYN is extremely expensive because of the high malpractice insurance rates. There is a bit of a loophole that can be used wherein states can mandate that insurers can't change the rates for this particular cause. But that
Hmm.
ultimately might just mean that insurers don't kind of pull themselves out of the market entirely or leave the state because it would bankrupt them. So litigation being the way a lot of things are run in this country,
Yeah.
CYA medicine, cover your ass medicine is certainly one of the reasons
Yeah.
we have such high C-section rates in the United States. Um, Litigation will ultimately be at least the undoing to a great extent of the ability to access this type of treatment through quote unquote legitimate means. You'll probably see a big black market. You already see stuff like on that in that realm in the UK. But for parents who do not approve of going through the black market to get very serious drugs for their children, um, I would imagine that within probably about 5 years, it probably will not be feasible in most places, if not all in the country, to get that type of treatment.
Hmm.
This is an educated guess of what will probably happen.
Yeah.
The philosophical debate will continue. It'll probably be worse in the same way that, Ruth Bader Ginsburg had argued, Roe v. Wade was poorly timed, poorly argued, because the country had not yet settled this acrimonious debate. If it had come maybe a little later, or the reasoning were different, maybe there wouldn't have been such a backlash. I think maybe she's being a bit naive, but that at least was her
Hmm.
argument. I anticipate something very similar will probably happen in the United States, where people will think, oh, well, this was decided on our behalf by the bad guys, by the lawyers who are transphobes and then just out for a payday. Therefore, our cause is righteous and we must
Yeah.
continue it. So the question is, will young people continue to identify as transgender and experience gender dysphoria in great numbers, or will it sort of pass and something else will come about? In the same way we've seen the ebbs and flows and eating disorders and that sort of thing, or the repressed memory movement in the 70s and 80s and multiple personality disorder and all of these different psychiatric phenomena, which are socially contagious, that have impacted adolescent females in particular. So, and I'm not saying necessarily that I believe that those things are akin, but these are the ideas that are thrown around at least. So like it might be one of those things where it just kind of dies out and kids migrate to something else.
Hmm.
Or, all along this, the veil was sort of been lifted. There's less stigma than there used to be, and trans kids were there all along, and this continues. I don't know, but the legal aspect is a lot more clear of what'll probably happen to me.
Okay. Yeah. Do you have any predictions about your own trajectory from HIV
Right.
journalist to gender
Yeah.
journalist?
I don't know.
What's
It's as a freelancer, my brother
yeah.
will say like, what are you doing, this fall? I'm like, I know the next 3 weeks,
Yeah, yeah, I'm
So
kind of in the same boat.
yeah.
But
I
where
mean, I
where do
find it
you
all
want to
very
go?
interesting.
Yeah.
Um, I don't think I can really answer that. I just know that at this time, I find it all very fascinating, compelling, and it's rewarding to
Yeah.
be in a space where people are paying attention to it.
Yeah.
Especially having written about a subject, HIV, that is on the fringes for so long, and occasionally people are interested, but mostly not at all. So it is certainly enlivening, if nothing else, to be in the middle of something that is people consider to be important. So hard to say, but wouldn't it be nice if some of the quote unquote other side might be more willing to discuss things with me? I guess I would hope that in time, some of them might reason that it's in their own best interest to be more open and transparent.
Hmm.
And that the mere association with one of the bad guys is, that sort of the canceled folks, is not contagious, so to speak. So,
Mm.
and I've seen that a bit with Marcy Bowers. She's given me a couple of interviews, but then she turns around and falsely accuses me of misrepresenting her words, and I have to get in this back and forth with her where I say, "This is the exact transcript of what you said. This is how I paraphrased it. Therefore, I paraphrased it accurately. No, you didn't." I said that there's nowhere I can go with this, Dr. Bowers. And hearing from other people, she does that all the time, and so you know, yeah, you're trying to work in good faith, and then you try to manipulate me afterwards. I don't appreciate being falsely accused. I take this
Yeah.
very seriously, fact checking and making sure I represent people accurately.
Yeah.
So, there was when the WPATH files came out in the spring that Michael Schellenberger published. There was, I'm forgetting his name now, but there was a guy out of California, a psychiatrist, and I reported it just in a tweet that he scoffed at this other doctor in this message board forum that they were discussing cases, and this doctor was concerned, oh, this patient I have is all these multiple psychiatric comorbidities. Is it right to put them on cross-sex hormones now? And this other doctor, scoffed, like, what's the problem? Something to that effect. And like, there's nothing in the guidelines that say that these are contraindications for being on treatment. And so I described him as scoffing, and he found me and emailed me directly and got very annoyed with me that I used the term scoff. And I said, well, let's look at the evidence. What's the tone? Maybe I'm not hearing your tone of voice. And I ultimately said to him, well, doctor, whatever his name was, here's the thing. you definitely scoffed at that woman in the message forum in the same way that you are scoffing at me now. Therefore, what I said was accurate, and I will not change it. Sometimes I must admit this. This is a bit of self-righteousness that comes about when you have outwitted somebody who's trying to undermine you by pretending you don't know what you're doing. Like I do, and the answer is no. When I used to be a cater waiter, and it's such a sad, subservient job, and be treated terribly by everyone around you.
Yeah.
The only power that you have is at the end of the night when they close the bar, and that drunk guy wants one more, is to say no. And it was nothing on me, but it was just like, no. And they're furious. How could you? It's just right there. And I don't say, you don't understand. This is all I have. So being able to say no to people with unreasonable requests is somewhat satisfying, I must say.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I guess wrapping up the question, we began with kind of looking at gender journalism with a, emphasis on the journalism.
Mhm.
What's your opinion on the state of journalism now
Oh,
and
no.
going forward?
Well, you've seen a lot of debates about what place advocacy per se has in reporting, putting your finger on the scale. And everybody sort of has a different opinion about, both sidesism, it's called, when you're giving equal weight to a lopsided debate. And the classic example of that is climate change and how long different publications and news channels would put, one climate crank on with the climate scientists, despite the fact that the climate crank represents a diminishing proportion of all climate scientists and ultimately is almost nil at this point. So
Hmm.
there's been a lot of overcompensating, I think, of people who don't want to do that. And that sometimes leads them to put their finger on the other scale, which is to leave out substantive criticism of a major issue such as pediatric gender medicine. So you're seeing a lot of internal debates about that. The debates are healthy, and I hope they continue. I myself am one who does not believe in reporting advocacy. There's somebody who writes about gender issues from a legal standpoint who, puts in activist statements. Or if you look at Mark Joseph Stern from Slate, the guy is a political writer. There is a right way to do it and a wrong way. We want this outcome. And, it's a liberal preference. And that's fine. If you want to do that, you're known for that, and everyone knows that you're essentially, partly an opinion columnist while reporting the news. That's not my way. I don't believe in that, and partly because people hopefully will take you more seriously, about whatever you say. You're not a Chicken Little effect. You think you can trust, wherever you are in the spectrum of what's going on, that what you're saying is true and not just an
Mm,
outgrowth of your opinions.
yeah.
So that to me is of the utmost importance for the way I do it. But obviously the media industry is shrinking rapidly. Money is drying up, people are getting laid off, and
Is it
that
though? It
makes
seems like it's expanding, but it's expanding into citizen journalism, so called, or
yeah, but like
independent
that, there's not
journalism.
that much money there. If you're going to talk about
Yeah.
if we somehow were able to tally the cumulative dollar value of everyone's salaries who works in media, like
Okay.
that's
Yeah.
shrinking.
Yeah.
Even if Substacks are cropping up, and if Matt Iglesias makes a lot of money, or Barry Weiss's publication makes millions, that kind of
Yeah.
thing. So the media is shrinking. That makes people risk averse, and that's a problem because ultimately stories that might have been told just don't get told, and then therefore the public thinks they understand something sufficiently when they really don't because they haven't been told. One story, you hear a lot about the story of families fleeing Texas or Florida to get the care for their trans kid in Virginia, wherever it might be. And I don't know, you hear there, surveys saying it's very common to want to flee the state, be the adult or families with transgender children. Um, but I also hear a lot of moms will come to me. It's never been a dad; it's always mom saying, like, I know my child and they identify as transgender, and it's not a genuine reflection of who they are. They describe them as captured and use language like that. So that's a story that does not get told. It's a story that undermines a political cause, as stories about detransitioners
Hmm.
do,
Hmm.
as well. But these people's feelings are also valid. They're also going through turmoil. And I would imagine, I don't know this to be true, that it's probably more common that families are ambivalent at the least about a kid being interested in gender transition treatment. And the stories of ambivalence or opposition told position of empathy are not being told. And that to me is a problem because these
Doesn't give you a clear
parents do love
picture.
their children
Yeah.
and they're being portrayed as evil. You'll see TikTok influencers, just one in
Hmm.
particular, I forget the person's name, encouraging children to divorce themselves from their families and that
Marsh,
kind of thing.
Jeffrey Marsh.
That would be the one very famously says that all the time, but at least once. I don't know how often the person said that, but
Yeah.
um, what's it like to be in that family? What's it like when a kid says, we must flee Texas? And my mom says, your father just got this job. We can't unroot. Your sister's got the medical treatment. She's got cancer, whatever it might be. You know, I would very much like to know about those dynamics because I would imagine they're probably more common is those sorts of conflicts. Whereas the type of people who are willing to have their story told by the New Yorker or whoever are very likely to people who are like fully on board. We're so on board, we want to make a cause and we want to be seen and advocate for this through a journalist.
Hmm.
People who are ambivalent are a lot less likely to want to be ambivalent in public.
Yeah.
So you got to get like at least one family to go on the record. So that's one thing I would like to tell that story myself.
Yeah.
And not for the purpose of trying to undermine a movement or anything, but to say like, I hear from these very distraught mothers all the time. And they don't come to me with words of bigotry in their mouths. They come to me
Yeah.
concerned. I don't think this is right for my child. So those people deserve to be heard as well.
Hmm. There's a large part of the iceberg that, for one reason or
Yeah.
another, is staying silent.
Oh, yes.
To avoid political, personal persecution, and or to quite wisely
Hmm.
protect their relationship with their child and or their child.
Yeah. I mean, there's a nonprofit that I won't go into specifics that I have something to do with just in my own personal life. And there's a person I know who's on their board. And, you know, there's all these sort of hushed tones discussions where the person, confides in me like, I don't agree with the direction of this institution and, that they're being overly progressive on these certain issues to do with transgender children and gender business, et cetera. And so, but this is all said like this, it's also the
Mm.
hushed tones and the sort of the
Hmm.
silent majority liberals, if you will, um, who are afraid to speak out about their ambivalence or their questions because of who dominates the loudest voices in the room, especially in an era of social media. They get the most traction and they're the ones who are heard. So they dominate the discussion. But it is my belief and general experience that most people are somewhere in the middle and they're more circumspect at the least
Hmm.
about this particular issue. And it has to do with a very traumatic treatment affecting a child's body, their reproductive ability, et cetera. And so if you're going to do that, you should really know what you're doing. And the ultimate assessment by many people in the evidence-based medicine arena is that the evidence is poor and inconclusive, and in effect, that these practitioners don't know what they're doing. That's ultimately what the systematic reviews say, what the Cass review out of England has
Hmm.
said. So that raises many questions. Also, just like how does anyone know what they're doing in medicine? There are many examples of how difficult it was to prove that the radical mastectomy, in which you don't just take out the breast, you take out like the pectoral muscle and all these lymph nodes, and it's very disfiguring. Betty Ford had it. That surgery was conducted for like a century, and nobody wanted to be involved in clinical trials, to do a randomized controlled trial. They wanted one to either perform one surgery or, receive another. And so it took like a decade in the 70s to gather enough data to prove that there was no difference in outcomes between a lumpectomy or mastectomy and a radical mastectomy. And so you can see in history how people have been so certain of things for so long, and it's their bread and butter as well, and
Hmm.
how hard it is, and how much resistance it is, and how hard it is and how much time it takes. But tell that to a kid whose puberty has, they just started to notice they're getting, changes in their body, signaling the onset of puberty. Tell that kid to wait 10 years for the better research to come in. That's the problem, is that even more intensely than, say, a woman's biological clock, try to extend that through IVF or something, puberty is a much more focused and condensed clock going off, and which is creating anxiety. So it creates a kind of a paradox, and that's
Hmm.
the problem. Is that there are so many loud voices who are demanding this now, and they can't wait. It'll be too late for them. Then they look too masculine and can't pass them. Back to where we started this whole discussion.
Hmm. Benjamin Ryan, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you. Thank you for your time. Where can people find you and what's coming
Let's
down
see.
the pike for
Jimmy
you?
down the pike. I'm on Substack. I think it's benryan.substack.com, or if you just Google Benjamin Ryan Substack. My website is benryan.net. My Twitter is Ben Ryan Writer. And what's coming down the pike? What can I say? We're definitely looking toward the Supreme Court case. I'm hoping to attend the oral arguments, I think
When is
in the
that?
fall.
In the
They
fall.
don't know
Yeah.
yet. Maybe the briefs are due by the latest in mid-October, so sometime after that. And just covering other things in the HIV world as well. There's a big case called Braidwood versus Becerra that's just been appealed today by the Biden administration to the Supreme Court, that could ultimately invalidate what's called the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force. And it's an unelected body, that's the clincher of the case, that has the authority to effectively mandate insurance coverage for various preventative therapies, screenings, and
Hmm.
interventions, such as PrEP, but also like mammography and things like that, or like, an hepatitis C test or HIV test and all these other things. So that ultimately might be deemed unconstitutional, which would throw somewhat into chaos the planning for HIV prevention strategies going forward because of newer forms of PrEP that will be very expensive and are still on patent versus the older ones that are now very cheap. And by the way, going back to the point of all those guys arguing that I didn't know what I was saying about the list price of Truvada, the HIV prevention pill, being the reason why nobody took it, that list price has been like $20 for the last, let's see, 3.5 years, and not much has changed. So, like, I rest my case. But that'll
Hmm.
be a really pivotal case. I'm increasingly interested in the law, which it's similar to science. There are rules,
Yeah.
and you're trying to follow them, and you're trying to figure out what the rules are and how they apply in the real world. So,
Yeah.
and within those rules are stories. So I like that about it. I'm very sort of precise and, interested in logistics. That's why I always liked ballet. It's because it's all about rules. It's very strict.
Yeah.
You
Huh.
follow them. So that I find those things very compelling, being, sort of a nitpicky, compulsive person.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, great. I'm
Yeah.
going to end the recording. I'll send people to your work, and just
Thanks.
personally speaking, thank you very much for
Thanks.
doing it. Just
Yeah,
brilliant
it's great
stuff.
talking. Thanks.
Yeah.
All right. It's
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I ended the recording, but thank you very much. You